How's it going?
It's going well. It's going well.
It's been a
Yeah,
while.
it's been a while. I know. I had to move.
Yeah. Well, we should actually we never we haven't been doing this. We should do this for every show. Welcome to Chit and Cha,
Yes, welcome. Welcome to Chit and Cha. To Chit and Cha.
where we talk about mostly about art history, but sort of other any sort of topic that we think the public might
And
find it
tea.
interesting. And of course, tea because it's hot now. We all both
Are we
drinking
both
iced
drinking
tea.
iced tea? I love
Yeah. What kind of iced tea are you drinking?
I am drinking vanilla apricot
Uh-huh.
rooibos iced tea.
Mm.
It's just a rooibos tea that I just, made, but it's
Yeah.
really nice. I generally don't like rooibos tea very much,
Yeah.
so the vanilla and the apricot are helpful.
Oh, I should have that. I have something in my cabinet.
No, it's
um,
not. I need something that's not caffeinated.
yeah.
Otherwise, I'm like all day.
So this is just a straightforward green tea that I got. It was on sale at the store, so it's nothing fancy, but so and I'm making iced tea out of it because
Amazing.
I don't believe in using expensive tea and putting ice in it.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Um, how hot is it down there? How hot was it
It's
today?
in the 90s, low 90s. The issue is the
Yeah,
humidity.
yeah.
So
That's definitely iced tea weather.
yeah.
I'm just doing it because I was really thirsty. It's actually really beautiful today. I'm in Minnesota. I'm in Afton, Minnesota, and it's just so beautiful here. And it was like low 70s all
Oh,
day today,
perfect.
really windy,
Oh, yeah.
but kind of perfect weather.
Perfect weather to be outside.
Exactly.
I'm
That's why it was so hard for us to schedule this conversation.
we should do it outside.
I know the wind is there's too much wind. I don't think
Yeah.
you'd be able to hear me.
I'm still in Baton Rouge, so I'm still here, just sort of in between storms, I suppose. We had one, I think, last week or the week last week, a big storm coming through.
What kind of, like
Cristobal
a thunder and lightning or?
is a tropical storm, which
Yeah.
the actual storm didn't cause that much damage, and then the second day after the storm technically have passed, I think there were remnants of it, and it dropped. I think it had like a big sort of downpour.
Mhm.
Within like 20 minutes, there were like 5 inches of rain in like
Mhm.
6:30 in the morning. So,
Wow.
so I think some people suffer from that. But
Yeah, of course, of course.
yeah,
And are the crocodiles out?
I'm sure they are out, but I'm not.
But I was wondering, like in a big storm, if they like come out onto the streets or
As
something.
long as they don't come through the toilet.
Mm, yeah.
No, they don't. That's in Florida. That's
Something to
Florida.
watch out for. Well, I'm sort of looking forward to, but also kind of loathing our topic for today because
Hmm.
politics are everywhere, and I sometimes want to run and escape from them. But then I also know it's so important and it's intertwined with
Hmm.
every aspect of our lives.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm looking forward to thinking about some sort of political questions with regards to objects I've never seen or maybe haven't thought about with you. So that should be fun.
Yeah.
Keep it
Absolutely. I
different from
want.
the politics that I read on my phone every 5 minutes.
Right. I think it's also helpful to think about sort of earlier moments in history. So these
Yeah.
examples of thinking about political activism, but also using art and the role of artists in politics. So I have a great example today. So if you don't mind, I'll just go ahead and start. So I thought, given what's happening with the really not just the United States, but also the protest movement have sort of embroiled the whole world. I think it's appropriate to sort of revisit this particular image, which is a very iconic image in China, but I think it has a very specific universalist tinge to it, done by the artist. He's most famously known for his wood carvings and this sort of very direct, immediate style, Li Hua, called Roar China. And just a very quick, funny anecdote. This became such a sort of well, I'll save that anecdote at the end. Actually, is more appropriate at the end. So this is the image. Raw China is a fairly small image. It's done on wood block carving. Is done in 1935, so fairly early in the 20th century. It was done by Li Hua, who was part of this sort of wood block carving sort of movement, trying to use the medium to convey certain leftist or progressive leaning in China at the time. And certainly many of them were either communists or certainly very much closely associated with communism and socialism at the time. Just to give you a gauge of where this was, in 1921, that's when the Chinese Communist Party was founded in Shanghai. And unsurprisingly, these images found its audience within the intellectual class in major cities like Shanghai and in Guangzhou. But Shanghai was really the hub where many of these images were circulated. And these images respond very much to some of the political actions and activisms happening at the time. This is just to illustrate that they are, of course, the medium of woodblock print. It was actually very long. It has a very long history in China. On the right, for example, is the first printed image really in the world that we still have examples of, from 868 in the caves of Dunhuang, illustrating the Diamond Sutra. Certainly you can see the style is quite different compared to the more refined and detailed sort of detailed sort of styles that meticulous style that you would see in historical woodblock prints illustrating the Buddha's assembly, versus I think this particular style, which seems very bold, very sort of loud, very sort of in your face type of aesthetics. And I should also want to situate the audience to think about, at the same time, these type of very politically driven, very the message is all about sort of a certain type of ideology, the type of image you see on the left. At the same time, those images are around. You also have the images like the one on the right, which is basically an ad, and many of these sort of beautiful sort of ads for cigarettes, for commercial sort of goods were appearing in Shanghai as well. You see her body is framing a beautiful nighttime view of a sort of newly electrified Shanghai night sky. So these type of image coexist. On the right is really an epitome of using sexuality to sell in the service of capitalism. And on the left, I think the message is rather different. It's quite opposite. We can even think about the use of body, the use of both type of body, one using it as a sort of very commercial and subjective way, the other one perhaps a little bit more universalist and more empathetic to sort of get across a certain type of message. So just very briefly looking at this particular image, what are we looking at here? We see a man with his hair cut very short. He is blindfolded. His body is tied to a stake in ways that sort of zigzag and carries our eyes up and down to his very taut, very muscular body, full of strength that have been now completely under restraint. His claw-like hands seems to be sort of reaching out in agony, and seem to be also reaching out for the knife that somehow just seems to be within or perhaps outside of his reach. Of course, the tension of this whole piece is that, is he able to grab that knife and free himself, or is he unsuccessful in that endeavor? He is screaming, but we don't see or have any indicator of sound. And so oftentimes people have interpreted this as a personification of China itself. Certainly in the 1930s, and really before and after that, China was under a lot of political unrest. There were the threats of Japan. that annexed sort of Chinese territory of Manchuria in 1931, and eventually in 1937 invaded China officially. Um, so there was the threat of Japan, but other imperial sort of forces in China at the time. But there were also internal sort of domestic sort of persecutions as well. Certainly the communists and the left-leaning intellectuals, including Li Hua themselves, these were persecuted, actively persecuted by the nationalist government who were in power at the time. That actually, in fact, led to a lot of well, as we will see, it led to a lot of sort of violent crackdown. Part of the inspiration that these left-leaning intellectuals were drawing from were the works of the German expressionist Käthe Kollwitz, whose work that we see here, The Volunteer, 1923. We, using the same sort of immediate, very simple graphic language to convey and center around the human body to convey a certain type of universal suffering that we can be empathetic toward and sympathetic toward as well. So these works are very much about the common people. Here is an example to give you also a set up a sense of the environment from which that these works were created. This is by the artist Yang Feng, who killed the resistors. We see in this very dramatic diagonal composition in the upper left-hand corner. We see people fleeing from the upper left-hand corner to the lower right-hand corner, people's faces fleeing in terror. And of course, we see the sources of that terror, the policemen. Under the flag of the rising of the sun, which would be normally in white and blue, which is the flag of the Nationalist Party, which is you can still see in Taiwan today. They were the one in power at the time, and they were really cracking down on leftist populist movements, but also massive protests. Protesters and open fire on these protesters. So to think about what I find very interesting is to think about the role of artists in all of these works, especially left-leaning sort of artists and as activists. The professor Xiaobin Tang in this article, talking specifically about this print, has this wonderful quotes I think is helpful to think about Li Hua's work and also his fellow artists' work, but hopefully reminds us about the role of artists in general. By giving the name China to the subjective intervention to be mobilized by his artwork, the artist at once expressed his commitment to the nation as a cause and revealed his conception of the role of an artist. The artist was able to be an agitator as much as a clairvoyant, someone whose mandate it was to awaken the nation, to sort of call up the nation. So in this way, to think about the work, not necessarily the figure as China himself, because certainly we already see him roaring, but rather to think about this image as the artist, as an imperative, as a call to arms. An artist's role using this image is to awaken the people to action, to call the people, the viewer to action, watching this particular figure suffering, this sort of symbolic figure suffering, and coming to the rescue of these figures and doing something about it. Lastly, I want to sort of close by thinking about how this image, as you know, is racially fairly ambiguous, and its nudity sort of further suggests a certain type of universality. And this theme, of course, was also a very universal theme as well at the time. There are other artistic works that were also called War China, including the work by the Soviet futurist who was teaching in Beijing at the time, Sergei Trainikov. He's had a poem from 1924 and also the play from 1926. Both play in probably a very significant role in inspiring this particular image. But I think I want to sort of also bring it back to perhaps the aftermath. 2 years after this was completed, Langston Hughes, perhaps looking at this image, perhaps thinking about the play, also composed his version of Roar China, seeing the imperialist and colonial projects, incursion in China and the suffering of Chinese people as parallel to the suffering of African Americans in the United States. Langston Hughes actually visited Shanghai at the time too. This is the entire poem. I'll just read it quickly, and you can certainly have some more time to think about it. Laugh and roar, China, time to spit fire. Open your mouth, O dragon of the east, to swallow up the gunboat in the Yangtze. Swallow up the foreign planes in your sky. East bullet, O makers of firecrackers, and spit out freedoms in the face of your enemies. Break the chain of the East, little coolie boy. Break the chains of the East, red generals. Break the chains of the East, child slaves in the factories. Smash the iron gates of concessions. Smash the biased doors of missionary houses. Smash the revolving doors of Jim Crow YMCAs. Crush the enemies of land and bread and freedom. Stand up and roar, China. You know what you want. The only way to get it is to take it. Roar, China. So this is also sort of continuing on the theme of imperative and calling sort of people to action and reaffirming the role of an artist, an active role of the artist in all of these sort of political activism. So I think that's all I have.
I was just thinking, this is really wonderful, William. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I was just thinking when you said, what strikes me is that this dagger is out of his reach, right? That this man, this figure is, I shouldn't say man, but this figure's body is tied and tethered. And so in some ways, it's not even really a call to action as much as a call to vocalize, right? To protest, to sort of to give voice to one's struggle, or to, certainly in Langston Hughes's words, to sort of articulate all that one desires and wants, the sort of things that one wants, which I think is so powerful and so potent to think about also.
Well, this idea of literally giving the voice to the voiceless, and this is actually something that Tang Xiaoping talks a lot about, and he's sort of connected to some of the movie, but also songs that were also written at the time too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems, it's certainly something that I've been thinking a lot about in our recent sort of moment and the protests that have been unfolding around us, and the ways in which I feel able and comfortable to participate in those kinds of protests isn't always to gather, logistically difficult with young children sometimes, and also the COVID-19 pandemic and self-quarantine, but thinking about how one can protest through words, and how writing and vocalizing those kinds of struggles and one's participation in them can be just as powerful.
Absolutely.
So maybe if we want, I really want to come back to this idea of the body also, but maybe I'll show my image.
Sure.
Because I think we can talk about the body. I think there's interesting ways to think about that too. So let me pull mine up. Okay, so the image that I actually wanted us to look at is this image that I don't have the exact date for it. It's an image that is in a private collection in Maryland, in Potomac, Maryland. But there are lots of posters like these. It's a kind of a bazaar poster, a bazaar as in market, BAZAAR, bazaar. And there are a lot of these sort of nationalist kind of posters, images of freedom fighters that circulate in India throughout the 20th century, and particularly around the sort of middle part of the 20th century, the second quarter to the to just after the half mark of the 20th century. But I like this one because we have some familiar players, and then we have some totally unfamiliar players. Um, and for me, one of the reasons why I also think this image um, is relevant now, even though it was probably made over 50 years ago, is the close connection between religion and politics. And that's certainly something that continues to be quite troubling from my perspective, sort of watching daily politics play out in India. And so I'll just kind of go through like what we're looking at, and we can then just talk. Oops. There we go. Oops. So the figure that we have in the center is Bharat Mata. This is an image, or Mother India, and we see her standing on a globe, right, and sort of right on top of the Indian subcontinent. She's holding the Indian flag, and with one hand, she has her hand, it looks like her hand is raised in this welcoming gesture, right? It looks like Abhaya Mudra. And she's beautifully adorned in this exquisite sari, and lots of jewelry, and really in many ways looks like a Hindu goddess. And the first, time, one of the first images that we have, there we go. One of the first images that we have of Mother India, of Bharat Mata, is an image that was made by Abanindranath Tagore in 1905 to protest the British proposed partition of Bengal, and there's been lots of work, lots of scholars who've talked about this image and other images of Bharat Mata in particular, but I think there are a couple of things to just point out, right? That first of all, the nation is being depicted as a female, right? Is being realized as in a female body, as a female goddess in many ways. And so right away we have the nation is female. The nation is also Hindu, and so we can sort of think about that, what that's doing. So we have Bharat Mata right at the center, and then we have some of these political players sort of surrounding her, flanking her on either side. So we've got Vallabhbhai Patel, who's on the left, sort of these two gentlemen who are just to Bharat Mata's right, sort of on the left side of our screen. Vallabhbhai Patel, who was the first deputy prime minister of India. He was all of these guys, a lot of these guys anyways, were leaders in the Indian National Congress, and Patel certainly was one. He was one of the kind of founding fathers of the Republic of India, and he was a politician. And we see he was also he, along with the gentleman who he's standing next to, Rajagopalacharya, or Rajaji, who was the last Governor General of India. This was before India became a republic. He was the first Indian-born Governor General. These were always positions that were held by British men, but he sort of had that role. He was also an Indian National Congress leader, and he, along with Patel, Rajagopalacharya, and Nehru, who we see on the other side of Bharat Mata, were really kind of three important men who ruled India from 1948 until certainly the 50s, 1950. I should also say that Rajagopalacharya, who's the gentleman that you see in the detail on the right, he was also a sort of big supporter of the nuclear disarmament movement, and sort of a peace activist as well. And then we have Jawaharlal Nehru, who's on our left, who's the first Prime Minister of India, and certainly a well-known figure and politician, a modernist in many ways. And then you have the gentleman he's standing next to in the sort of darker blue jacket was the first president of India, Rajendra Prasad, who had that role from 1950 to 1962. So we have, sort of on either side of this mythological image of Bharat Mata, this sort of this figure, sort of deified image of the nation. We have these important kind of founding father political figures on either side, sort of standing, walking together, arm in arm. And then we have some other interesting figures like Subhash Chandra Bose, who was also an Indian nationalist, and he was an avid anti-colonialist, very much against the British, but he sort of infamously aligned himself with the Nazis during World War II, and sort of in many ways his name has sort of been tainted ever since then. And then on the opposite side of him, on the other side of Bharat Mata, we have Swami Vivekananda, who was a Hindu monk and a kind of 19th century mystic who was kind of responsible in many ways for popularizing Hinduism and really led the kind of Hindu revivalist movement, certainly in the 19th century. So we've transitioned now from politics to religion, sort of seamlessly in the clouds, as it were, sort of floating around our mythological figure of Bharat Mata. And then we have Jesus Christ, who I thought you would, in William in particular, I thought you would find this to be a sort of fascinating addition to this poster here. And then another important religious figure, Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. And then at the very top, sort of looking down on everyone, this sort of, in many ways, a kind of fatherly figure, saint-like, which makes me think that this poster was made after 48, after Gandhi was assassinated. We see Mahatma Gandhi at the very top, sort of participating and I would say, supporting all that's happening in some ways, even though he had sort of different relationships with all of these, certainly of the various politicians. And so I think, for me, what's so fascinating about this image is you have, right, it's both, you've got this realm of the spiritual with the image of Christ and the Buddha and Vivekananda, and then you've got formalized religion, and then you've got this sort of realm of the mythological in the image of the Bharat Mata, right? This sort of this goddess who was in some ways created in the early 20th century as a way to visualize what nationalism, what it means to be a nation, what nationalism looks like. And then you've got these politicians, and particularly Indian National Congress politicians, all participating in this kind of surreal scene. And I think, for me, I think there's been some great work on these kinds of prints, these kinds of posters. Certainly Christopher Pinney's work, and I think there we go. Christopher Pinney's work has been one that I've really enjoyed his work on these kinds of images, right? And one of the things he says in Photos of the Gods is that, that realism, this sort of photorealistic images, in India were not necessarily about making something look like reality, or making, creating depictions or representations that were mimicking reality, but instead they were deployed to create the mythological, to create the magical, to create the supernatural. And that seems to be very much what is happening in this kind of image. And then he also talks extensively about how chromolithography is used very much for political means. And that in India, you see it's a sort of interesting combination between lithography, photography, theater, politics, the market, in terms of sort of where these images are circulating, because these are very inexpensive posters, very sort of cheaply produced kinds of images. And he does make the argument that nationalism, Indian nationalism itself, is being constructed and articulated, particularly through these kinds of diverse, bizarre pictures, these kinds of posters. And for me, the reason I wanted to bring this now is because, I got a letter. There was a letter circulating just last week about how JNU, that's Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, the sort of very famous, one of the best universities in the country, and has a reputation of being sort of kind of leftist leaning, more liberal in its politics. And if you remember, through a lot of the protests that were happening in India recently against the Citizens Amendment Act, or the CAA, this sort of new law that was amending, requiring certain kind of citizenship for different immigrants to India, and a lot of the protests that were happening in the winter. And if you remember, I was in India at the time, so it made big kind of press in India, but I don't know if it quite had the same coverage here. But in January, there was a huge and sort of violent attack on students and faculty at JNU in sort of relationship to the mass protests that were happening in many cities all over India about the CAA, about this new immigration law that Modi's government had put in place. And just thinking about, sort of that recent, those sort of recent protests and events. And then last week, a letter that was circulating that JNU they had a kind of online webinar recently, where it was a historian was in some way sort of rewriting history, or was proclaiming an alternative view of history that was much more sort of right-leaning, much more favoring of sort of Hindu nationalist politics. And you just, this is what has been happening in India for the last few decades, is the erasure of sort of minority Muslim voices or contributions, increasing kind of Hindu nationalist politics, and a lot of not just communal tension, but the ways in which history is being rewritten, and art history too is being rewritten through these politics, which is certainly scary and troubling for so many of us. So I just thought, but so this kind of poster, to me, this kind of image certainly seems to, in some ways, be a foundation for some of that, and sort of an unlikely foundation for some of that. But we can start to think about these kinds of images and their circulation, and then where we are now, and how the work of some of these men has been so distorted,
Right.
but how religion and politics have become even closer aligned, I think would be.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you so much. I think if you stay on this image for a little bit to think about, I mean, the claim too, I think, as with the Li Hua sort of wood block sort of print, is the universality of it, right? It claims to be a certain type, of course, it's also a very distinctly Indian view of universality, to a very Protestant, sort of this very popular sort of depictions of Jesus from 19th and 20th century. And there's a lot of work done on that, to think about this version of Jesus as an icon.
Exactly.
So this is not, it's not surprising at all. I still actually sometimes see this, but it does sort of claim to sort of establish a sort of universality under the aegis of Hinduism, right?
Absolutely.
And you see both Buddha and Jesus in Hindu temples still today. Of course, conspicuously absent is any representation, I shouldn't say depiction, since one could easily argue that there is, because of the prohibition of Islamic prohibition against sort of depicting the prophet, but there isn't any, at least from my perspective from here, I don't see any Islamic voices here.
Exactly. Well, and even if it's not about a depiction of Muhammad, we don't even see Jinnah, right? We're not even seeing, We're not
right,
even seeing, sort of politicians who would
right.
be representing
Yeah,
or articulating the sort of concerns and
right.
needs of the Muslim population.
Who was the politician within Gandhi's circle who was a very sort of basically a proponent of the Islamic
Oh,
sort of
Jinnah, yeah,
Jinnah,
that's
excuse me,
yeah,
yeah,
Jinnah, yeah,
yeah, yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So that and he's not in this image, and so I think
Hmm.
that's absolutely right. There's this the universality, but also the kind of Gandhi has arisen to the sort of level of sainthood, um,
Yeah,
right? Even beyond, in some ways, above,
yeah,
in the clouds with Vivekananda,
yeah.
with our Hindu mystic, but sort of even above that. But I think there's the ways in which the body is
Hmm.
depicted or erased in this image is also kind of interesting, and I think maybe um, different from the image that you were showing us by Li Hua, um,
Hmm.
but I do think it sort of it's interesting that we have some of these figures, right? We've got Nehru and Patel and others who are, we see them fully bodied. These
Yeah,
are kind of men of the earth, right? Men
right.
that are of politics, are in the country. They're sort of um, actively participating. We have then the body, the sort of Bharat Mata assuming the body of a female figure as sort of voluptuous, fecund, idealized female figure, female goddess, right? She looks just like, she looks so much like the images of Lakshmi
Hmm.
um, that are coming out of other kinds of bizarre prints and the work of Ravi Varma, right? And so we have that kind of bodily representation. Then we have the erasure of the bodies for, Gandhi and the Buddha and Christ and Bose, and so, right, that they're sort of in the clouds. They are no longer of this world. They're no longer alive, perhaps, but also
Hmm.
attained some other kind of status, right? Um, versus the image that you showed, which is so powerful for the bodily struggle, right? That you have this figure who's contained in the body, who's trying to sort of fight those ropes and struggling. The sort of bodily struggle, the musculature of that image is so powerful, and isn't able to move or act in his body, and only can roar, can only scream, which
Right,
I find
yeah.
to be, so interesting.
I mean, in both, I think is the use of body, of the complete body as a political sort of symbol, right? As a site of all of these
Absolutely.
sort of symbolic sort of reference. And I want to sort of turn our attention slightly to sort of think about things I'm sure I think a lot about, and it's the sort of the gazes, which by the way I just love Gandhi's gaze. Is for some reason he reminded me of the sun in Teletubby, the
And
little weird when it looks down. But 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 I mean, the only person making eye contact is Mother India, right?
yeah,
So you have that sort of moment of darshan. And by the way, in terms of the arrangement too, I'm thinking this is also has a much longer history in religious art, certainly in India, but I'm thinking also Tibetan sort of tankas as well,
right.
which itself
Interesting.
comes from that
Yeah.
type of composition
Yes.
with the central deity, but surrounded by all of these hosts of other deities or
Or Buddhists in
episodes
the various
from,
directions.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is interesting. That's so interesting. I mean, um, the it almost looks like, it looks a little bit to me like Prasad is maybe looking at us. And
Yeah.
then you kind of wonder, like, what is the source image,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
that there's obviously, I haven't done a lot of research on this image. I would need to do more to find that out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think it is really, and Gandhi not looking
Yeah.
at the viewer
Yeah.
seems pretty um, interesting. Also, the Buddha
I think,
not looking at the viewer is really
right.
interesting. Like, I've never seen a Buddha in a kind of profile three-quarter view like this
Yeah, well, I should also add, I think it is also based on a popular image as well. But I should also add that I think we take that for granted, but for the people watching this, all of these were most likely taken sort of pastiche, cut and paste from other
For
types of
sure,
literature.
for
Yeah.
sure, for sure. Um, yeah, absolutely. I also think that the lack of text is really interesting. I was
Mm-hmm.
struck by that when you showed the earlier woodblock print,
Mm-hmm.
and this the prevalence of text.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so little, and then there's no text on Li Hua's image,
Mm-hmm.
and then we have attribution to the printing studio, and then they have the title for this poster, which
Right.
is like the best message of love.
Yeah.
I find also really fascinating to kind of think about.
Actually, so that's actually what I was going to talk about, ask you about too. Isn't message of love to think about? For me, this actually looks, the only love that I can think of is actually mukti, right? The concept of mukti is sort of like this sort of revere love for gods and deity, and this is where the religious sort of message may be part of as well. And I don't know if that's a right reading or
Yeah, I mean, I think that could certainly be one reading. I
not.
mean,
Yeah.
it seems like maybe there's a way um, in which kind of love for the nation, a kind of
Mm-hmm.
the call for unification, which
Mm-hmm.
certainly, the politicians would be representing that kind of message, and certainly Bharat Mata is, that it's sort of your love for Mother India, your love for for the new nation.
but
Um,
but but I think it's precisely, and as you said, and for your reasons of bringing this image, is the appropriation of that religious sort of
for
sacred
sure.
gaze, love, and sacred rituals,
Yes,
right? The
exactly,
way
right?
it's set up and it's
Yeah,
translated into political. Is your love for this deity, this goddess, is the same as your love for the nation.
right. Well, and then, but it's weird to me also because, okay, yes, growing up a Protestant, and I went to Sunday school every Sunday, and I learned that Jesus Christ is love, right? This was
Right.
the sort of message that Jesus proclaimed was love thy neighbor, and it was all about love. But that's not necessarily what I understand of the Buddha's, doctrine. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems, I think of detachment. I think
Mm-hmm.
of right actions, right words, right, sort of, you want to certainly, you want to do good deeds, but that's different from, love your enemy. So love those who have sinned, right? Um,
I'm sure there are plenty of interpretation that will disagree with you, and there's plenty of modern contemporary New Age
yeah.
interpretation. I won't get into that, but yeah, no,
You
but that's
see
what I'm
my
saying.
apprehension of bringing this image though, because I thought there's actually too much here to talk about, and then I don't know
Yeah,
if I'm fully equipped
no,
to
but
talk
for
about it
me,
right
the message is love is actually Mother India herself, right?
now.
So
That's what I
right,
sort of see, and she is, and again, it's the Abhaya Mudra, right?
yeah, absolutely.
It's the
Which is
welcome.
what, yeah,
All
sorry,
are sort of all are welcome.
yeah, exactly.
Not quite.
It's sort of like I come in peace type of gesture, right?
Exactly.
That's actually how I tell my students. It's like the I come in peace gesture.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's the welcoming. It's the fearlessness, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
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 And certainly is a very rich and I think timely topic that we should sort of talk about and think about at this moment. Really also to think about the role of artists too, right? To think about the role of works like this. I think fundamentally what makes people act, right? How does these sort of works make people act?
Well, in some way, I think Li Hua's image, that to me is this powerful call to action, and that
Yeah.
to me is a way in which art can really inspire,
Mm-hmm.
political protest or
Mm-hmm.
inspire that kind of action. This poster to me seems like it's doing something different. In some ways, this seems like this is furthering existing political beliefs, or it becomes it's more in the line of propaganda to me than a kind of call to protest. This is, it is a way of saying this is the idea of an independent nation is a new one. or relatively new, not at this point necessarily new, but we're going to sort of reinforce how important this is and reinforce how saintly and godlike our, sort of divine, like our politicians, right? Our founding fathers, how significant they are. So it seems, I wonder, for me, it seems like the power of this image is not as much in the agency or action of the artist. So I certainly
Mm-hmm.
don't want to, devalue the role of the lithography studio that produced this, but it seems like the power is in the circulation and where these kinds of images move and who's seeing them and how they're then being used in their multiples.
So absolutely, but I think this sort of connection to action, not necessarily through manifested through protests or activism, since this is after the fact of independence, but is through the sort of the call of reinforcing a certain type of identity.
Yes.
That Indian identity is not just Hindu, but all of these, excluding Muslim to a certain extent.
It seems mostly like it's supposed to be Hindu, actually.
Right, but I think it's also, but it's interesting that the fact that Jesus, Christianity, which is a colonial religion,
right,
of the colonial masters, were also included as part of this nation.
Yeah.
As well as Buddhas, and there were not that many Buddhas.
Well, and I think the Buddha, in some ways, the Buddha can be interpreted as one of the dust avatars of Vishnu. At least that's how right? But I think you're right, though, that Jesus then is Jesus is the divine figure of the colonizer, right? And so that that sort of call to universality.
Right. Well, and also, of course, you know this much better. The Buddha was also association with the Dalit movement as well. Sort of this
with a what?
Dalit or Dalit.
Oh, the Dalit, the
Dalit movement,
for sure.
right?
Yeah.
Sort of rising, sort of bringing people who are usually in a lower caste system to be incorporated into this concept of nation.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And there are great posters of Ambedkar too. With and stuff like that. Well, and it does, what you were also saying about the sort of the role of artists in protests and thinking about Li Hua's work, but then also it's been the kinds of images, the murals, and the kinds of artwork that's been produced just in the last couple of weeks surrounding the protests of George Floyd's death. Of his murder have been really powerful to see also, and it's that certainly in these dark and troubling times that we live in, I do gain hope from seeing the kind of the creative expression and the ways in which people are able, and artists in particular, are able to visualize and represent these deeply troubling political problems and issues in sort of visually potent ways. Thank you, William.
Thank you. See you next time.
Yeah, it's really good to see you. And stay safe.
Yep, you too.
Stay cool.
Yep.
Drink that iced tea.
Yep.
You can tell I'm in Minnesota because it's almost, what time is it now? It's almost 7 o'clock and it looks like it's 2 p.m.
Oh my God.
The sun is just.
When is the sunset?
Not till like 9, it feels like. Not quite, but it's late. It's late.
Yeah.
Anyways. All right, my dear. Great to see you. Thank you all for anyone who's watching. Thank you. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
And until then.
Yeah, until then.
Okay.